Welcome to another episode of the CEO Story, and we've got a really intelligent guy for you today. So we've got Rob Huddock, who is the founder of Huddock Employment Law Group. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And you've got a great experience. You've got over 21 years of litigation experience, so you don't look old enough to have 21 years.
Yeah,
firstly.
well, it's interesting. I actually had 5 years before law school.
Oh, wow.
So I might be 5 years older than someone else who has this level of experience.
Well, you're looking really good for your age.
Thank you.
And then the notes that we've got is you went from big law to the human side. So can you explain what that means to you a little bit?
What it means to me is that in a big law firm, it's institutional. And you're dealing one entity, in a way, you're dealing with one entity and the client entity. Whereas in a firm like mine, you're personally interested in their business. Their business may be threatened by an employment lawsuit, depending upon what kind of lawsuit it is. And I personally take an interest in and a lot of times it's a family-owned business, in their business and making sure that they get through the matter as efficiently and effectively as possible and go on to running their family business, for example. But I have all types of clients.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The way I kind of understand that, help me make sure I am understanding it right, is that the bigger the firm, the less personal it really is. And as that size decreases, you tend to get a deeper connection with the people that you're working with. And it's so true in the accounting world where I come from. The big four accounting firms kind of eat up all the huge clients, and then the smaller mom and pops have a much deeper relationship with their clientele because they actually want to build a long-term and caring relationship rather than each client just being another number.
I suspect that what I'm describing is very similar to what you're describing in the accounting area.
Okay, perfect.
Now, I will mention this, that it depends upon the particular individuals that have the smaller firm, and that the level of personal involvement and care can vary, but generally speaking, yes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree then, because legal accounting is all very similar in the way structures happen and the way people think. But one of the things that really caught my eye with you is the way that you think differently and creatively compared to regular, let's say, lawyers. So can you talk a little bit about what caused or created that curiosity early on with you and how you developed that curious nature for problem solving?
Well, that's a good question, and it makes me think. And what I would say is I am a very curious person by nature.
Okay.
And also very individual. So I tend to gravitate away from tradition and towards, can this be done a different way, and is that different way perhaps better?
Yeah.
And I don't want to go too far from your question, but what I'll say in addition is I've also been, just personally again, someone who I consider myself a leader. And so when you're in an institutional type place, you may not get to express that as much as you want to.
Yeah, you can't put your own flavor on things as much as if it's your own firm, right?
And you develop the culture. That's your culture that you've developed. But I guess that at least partially answers your question, I hope.
It really does. And then you touched on it there, culture. So as businesses grow, and I can use myself as a prime example, I didn't really care about culture early on in my company because it was just me. I was the culture. But then as we grow and expand and scale, I start caring so much more about culture now than back 6-7 years ago when I started the company. How is that different for you in the legal side of things versus if you were working at a huge big firm versus being able to create your own culture? What does that mean inside your organization, and how do you build a better culture?
Well, we've just spent some time talking about how the big firm is more institutionalized and my firm, we want to be more personal and more involved in their businesses and things like that. Well, then culture becomes very important, because you want those folks who, and you want to promote within the firm, you want to promote people who are of that type, and you want to promote them to be the type of people, or to conduct themselves in a way that is going to come across, that feeling is going to come across. Mm-hmm. And the clients are going to really believe that. And it's true. I mean, and I guess that's what I'm saying, is that is the service we provide, mm-hmm. and that is the culture I want to promote, would be the very short answer.
No, it makes a lot of sense, because there's so many blind spots as people grow and scale their businesses in hiring the right people, creating the right culture. What do you think some of those things that people overlook most are from an employment standpoint?
Well, if we're talking about the culture aspect,
well, culture and employment in general, I think, is both.
Okay, very, very well. So in terms of the culture aspect, it's pretty straightforward. You might be so busy, tied up in running your business, that you're not seeing what's happening with everyone else, or the details, and as a result might stray away from your brand, basically. And that's very important. In terms of employment, let's just take a hypothetical startup company and we'll take it from the very beginning, and we'll use you as an example. Yeah. You're now developing 6 or 7 employees and things like that. Well, first of all, I'll say that when you cross the threshold of 5 employees, that's when you need to become a lot more careful, because that's the threshold for application of the Fair Employment and Housing Act, which is harassment, discrimination, retaliation, and also family leave in California. But I think what's most important for a company that's growing is get at it early, because ultimately what a lot of these folks want to do is they want to build up the company and then sell.
Yep.
And so what's going to happen when they go to find potential buyers? What are the potential buyers going to do?
Going to do your due diligence.
Due diligence.
Like, where the systems, where the processes, make sure the track record is good, because if it isn't, that can affect the insurance prices, the EBITDA, and ultimately the valuation.
Yeah, and that's a real thing. I mean, I know from personal experience and from M&A attorneys who I know that particularly in California, because it has notoriously the most employee-friendly laws in the United States, that a potential buyer is going to look closely at that. And there's various different categories, I guess I'll say, that they would look at and that they do look at when doing their due diligence.
Yeah, and my background's obviously European. I know how difficult it is to do business in France and Germany with the employment laws there. So even though California is trickier than other states, it's a lot easier to do business here than in France, as an example. So anyway, we digress on that one. But can you share some of the biggest issues from the sale of a business? Because I think that's really important as we grow and scale our companies. The natural next step for a lot of people is to exit that company. How important is it, or what are some of the things that people can do to make sure that employment law and all of the compliance with that doesn't affect the sale, or actually the price of the company also, right? Because there's two things there.
Absolutely. And I'll mention at the highest level that there's not only the potential cost of claims or the actual cost of ongoing claims, but also there's an administrative cost. Mm-hmm. If the buyer has to go in and start from ground zero and make changes and get people to accept those changes. If you have it going smoothly when you go in, it's basically point and shoot for the buyer.
So trying to make life as easy as possible for the potential future buyer early on, and being proactive rather than reactive, because costs you a whole lot more being reactive than it ever will being proactive.
You say easy, you want it to be easy and the least risky.
Least risk. Okay, so how can they minimize the risk for the future potential buyer if you're looking to sell your company?
And they're intertwined.
Okay.
And so one of the things that we've already talked about is compliance.
Yeah.
And with compliance, and it's easiest to start when you have fewer employees. It's easier to create the policies, implement the policies. You're going to have to change as you scale. But setting up the structure and getting the understanding while it's relatively small is going to be easiest and most efficient. Give you an example. If you have non-exempt employees, these are people that are generally paid by the hour, you would want to develop early on your timekeeping practices and policies and practices. And you'd want to have a good knowledge of what those are so that you can make sure you're following them from the very beginning. And we can get more specific than that, but I think you're talking at a higher level right now.
Yeah, I think it's good to give people specific actionable tips, but understanding the lay of the land is really important. Hey, you got to have this document in place so everybody is first treated equally, knows where they stand, knows what the expectations are. And then if that's a piece of software that does that, or if that is just you clocking in physically, in and out, whatever that is as a tactic versus a strategy is really what I'm hearing. Does that sound about right?
That's right. So let's say, a buyer 2 years down the line is doing their due diligence, and they see, wow, this person got right on it from the very beginning. What does that equal? A lot less risk.
Yeah, it gives you more confidence knowing that, hey, this is a very detail-oriented person. They know what they're doing, and they're running a good business. That's ultimately comes back down to numbers, right? Have you got the systems? Can you show that in terms of numbers? And that usually leads to good performance too.
And what you just said, having or implementing these policies and paying attention to them from the very beginning goes beyond employment law. It sends a message that you're just a good business and you've got a tight ship overall, and that's going to allow them to have more confidence, and that leads to more value.
100%. Like one of the things we've recently done in one of my businesses on the tax side is to implement EOS. So EOS is a framework from a guy called Gino Wickman, and ultimately it starts with the vision, the mission statement, the core values and beliefs, a lot of the cultural foundation set in. And then with each one of those subsets, you have a framework on how we're going to implement this. And ultimately, it all starts with that vision, and then it kind of peels the onion back a layer at a time to the point at which we have a 10-year plan, a 1-year plan, a quarterly plan, and then everyone's got their own quarterly plan that feeds into the annual plan, that feeds into the 10-year plan. So it always connects us all, overarching, moving in the same direction. So I really like that, and that's been a framework that we've used to really help us. And part of that, just linking it round to employment, is right people, right seats. And it's so true, and I didn't really understand it or really value it, so I didn't give it the time before. But having the right people in the organization in the right place, because you could be a great person, but if you're not set up for success in the right department, like if you're an accountant and you're in the creative art department, it's probably not going to work, or vice versa. It could be the right person, but you also have to have the right fit. That framework has worked really well for us.
And I would say that fundamentally, very fundamentally, the concept is similar or same. Meaning the concept of establishing your policies and procedures early on. Because look, policies and procedures are not just for avoiding risk, they're for employee satisfaction, let's say. Take that into consideration while you're doing it. But what I was going to say is, again, fundamentally, the concepts are the same, from starting as detailed as you can at that time and develop it into more as you go.
Definitely. Okay, so as we just exited the pandemic, What are the common employment law issues that you're seeing that come up more now in kind of, let's call it, a hybrid, remote versus online work environment? Has anything specific come from that, or that you've seen that's changed over recent times?
Yeah, by far the standout issues are in the wage and out. Well, it is in both the wage and hour and the type of harassment, discrimination, retaliation. Because let's just take one example. Okay, we're not in the office together. How could there be any harassment claims? Well, there's a lot of ways there could be. How could there be any discrimination claims? There are a lot of ways it could be, because let's look at it. Let's think of your typical Zoom meeting or whatever video platform that you use, and you've got the one person sitting in their home office or wherever. What do they have on the wall? Do they have a picture of something political? Do they have a picture of something that somebody might see as speaking negatively of women or a certain race? There's that. The other way that discrimination can come into the picture is that if one views being able to work remotely as a benefit, then you have a potential situation where you make decisions as to who works remotely, who doesn't, how much. That lays the groundwork, if you will, or that's that's the foundation, lays the foundation for potential discrimination claim. In that, let's say the person who you gave the remote work permission to is of one race, and the one that you didn't give it to is of another. So the one that you didn't give it to says, well, you gave him that benefit, you gave him that because of the fact that he is this race and I am this race.
Yeah, I hate all that stuff, to be totally honest, but it is real, it does happen. And what are some things that people can do to avoid that happening?
And when, in terms of risks created by hybrid work, is that what we're talking about?
Like, I'll just use myself as an example. I used to love the notion of, I want to work remote. Like, even when I was working for a corporate company, before I had my own company. And then I pretty much did work remote when I had my own company because I could. I had an office space, but I was just more comfortable smoking a cigar at my cigar lounge and having a good time. And then work at home if I need to, but having that flexibility of wherever my laptop is, I'm good. Then COVID comes around and we have to do that. And then everyone's isolated and it's like, okay, people are moving all over the place now. So it's not a controlled environment that everyone's in a room and we're all together, because you can control that culture a lot easier than if we're fragmented all over the place. Now, we're in this situation where we have a hybrid workforce, both overseas, internal, external, semi-remote, in person. So we've got some people here in the office in LA, we've got some in Tahoe, in Texas, in all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure the people that are sitting here are thinking, oh, well, I would love to be remote like the others. And it's like, how do you find that balance? I personally think that balance to life in everything you do. Too much of any one thing is a bad thing. So there should be or could be a way that we can engineer it, that we can get the best of both worlds, whether that's work remote on Friday or work remote one day a week. You pick whatever that is. So you get that flexibility so it's not so rigid and set in stone. But like you said, how do you then defend against, oh, well, this person over there has got full-time remote and they're at home playing with their kids and I'm stuck in an office where I don't really want to be, and that's discrimination. It's like, whoa, no, it isn't.
Well, I'll tell you, in terms of prevention, the most effective, most broadly applicable, mm-hmm. and the most bang for your buck, if you will, is having a specific set of remote work policies. And what I'm going to do for an example is give you one in, say, the wage and hour area. Or let's continue with discrimination, actually.
Okay.
you've got an employee who works in Texas, and then you have another employee who works in California. Well, the default rule with respect to which states, and let me go to the basics. Every state has their own set of discrimination, harassment, and all kinds of employment laws. And so when you have someone in another state, or you have someone that's moving from state to state, then you're going to have to deal with the issue of which state's laws applies and to what particular work that they're doing.
And does that all depend on where they're living at that given time?
That you're getting right to the issue. And so let's say you have someone who resides in Texas, and let's just say because they have remote work, they like remote work so much because they can go wherever they want and work.
Yeah.
Right? Well, what you could have as a remote work policy to seek to avoid or protect against claims that, oh, well, this state's laws applied, this state's didn't. What you can do in that instance is have a policy that says, you're going to perform your remote work, but if you perform that remote work, you're going to do it all from home office in Texas. Oh, this suite that you got in Tennessee. And they either explicitly or implicitly make an agreement to that. What that's going to do is that's going to make it reasonable for the employer to assume that they're doing their work pursuant to the policy. Then there's also a concept in law that basically says you're only responsible for what you knew or should have known. So if you have a policy that they're doing only their work in Texas, unless there's some facts that come up, there's no reason that you knew or should have known that they were working in Europe, because they're supposed to be following the policy. And that way you avoid the administrative burden and the complication of having to apply different states' laws and potentially having them working in a state that has more strict employment laws, if that all makes sense.
Yeah, no, it really does, because that's a really good strategy to use to get around that. Is kind of, this is our policy and don't tell us anything else, pretty much.
Now, facts that come up could change that. For example, if you were communicating with that same example employee and they said, oh, I'm here working over in Connecticut, that invokes the knew or should have known. At that point, you knew that that person was working somewhere other than their home office in Texas or whatever. So it changes there. But I think the general point here is have a remote work policy that addresses various different things that might come up in remote work, so that you can at least contain
a good baseline. Right?
Yeah, and you can contain somebody from completely going off the reservation as to what they're claiming. Yeah. This is and also have rules. Oh, do I have to apply this rule here? Do I have to apply this rule here? No, this is what the standard is, and this is what you need to do, and it's safe for me to assume that.
Yeah, I think it boils back to what we talked about earlier, is if you've got your policies in place and everybody knows what their expectation is, they know where to start at. Whether they deviate from that or not is a different matter. That's more of a performance matter. But you're being very clear in articulating what your expectations are from an organization.
Well, and that helps not only in everyday work, but think about it, that an employee makes an allegation that's employment related, and you want to build your defense as an employer. Point back to that policy book.
Yeah, so it's really, really important in that. And the phrase we do is we plan for the worst and hope for the best. So I think from a legal perspective, this is exactly the same, is that, hey, all of our ducks are in a row. We know exactly what's going on. We know what our policy states. We update it and review it frequently. So we've got this back in, and we know we've got A, B, C, D. If you haven't been following that, then that's on you, so to speak, right?
Yeah, and I know that a challenge for some businesses is, number one, looking at the administrative cost of having certain policies or enforcing certain policies and balancing that against, having a tight ship and minimizing risk. Also, in some industries, certain clients or certain employers will say, well, if I strictly enforce this, am I going to have any employees? Am I going to have anybody? So, for example, if people don't punch out for their meal periods, this is a California thing. The best thing to do from a minimizing risk standpoint is to say, if you don't punch out, the first time you'll get a verbal warning, let's say. Second time you'll get a written. Third time you're out.
So put that importance and value on it.
Absolutely, but then again, the the challenge there for some folks is they're in an industry where people will not always remember to do those kinds of things.
Right? Yeah. And it's such a small thing. It's like if you were to fire someone because they forgot to clock out 3 times for lunch, it's like, is that really a fireable offense?
That it is, and the thing is, it's a huge risk because it's not just that person you're concerned about, it's everybody in your entire and this is a California thing, it's everybody in your entire workforce who's non-exempt for the last 4 years.
So it's understanding the magnitude of that action with one person, extrapolating it over the workforce, extrapolate over the amount of years that it could potentially come back. So now you're probably talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, depending on how many employees you have.
Well said.
Yeah, because that's true. Because let's just say, I've been through this. I used to work for a huge engineering company. They had a union element and a non-union element. So they were really anal about, hey, we're clocking in here, we're clocking out here. It has to be this much. We have to take. And I was like, I've never really been like that personally. It's just, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get the job done. And I'm just wired very differently as an entrepreneur, as a business owner. And some people aren't. But you got to respect both sides of the story, right? And it's like, just because other people aren't wired that way, it doesn't mean they shouldn't get the right systems and processes to succeed. But it still doesn't sit well with me. If let's just use that example of, hey, you clocked out 3 times in a row wrong. We told you, we warned you, now you're fired. It's like, dude, you know how much money it's going to cost me to replace this person?
Well, I'll say this, and we'll see if
time, not just the money, but the time as well, right?
Yeah, and let me say this, a couple things. First, I'll say this. In my experience, if you're treating your employees like children, that's not good for morale.
Yeah, it's bad culture, right?
However, the way California law is, it's super paternalistic. And if you're going to avoid risk, you have to treat people like children in certain respects. And again, balance, coming back to that balance again. And with respect to the administrative cost that you're saying that goes along with replacing an employee, I think if you do the rough analysis, because you're not only dealing with that employee, you're potentially dealing with a huge scope of potential liability. The cost or the risk of having that liability far outweighs the cost, that administrative cost of dealing with that one person.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you zoom out and you look, hey, this is not just this one person in this one isolated instance. We've got to look at the wider risk. And when you assess it against that risk, it's a no-brainer, right?
It is. And let me be clear for your audience. What we're talking about as far as these class actions is wage and hour practices. Mm-hmm. That doesn't apply necessarily. There's rare exceptions to the other types of employment laws.
Got it. Perfect. So, Rob, thank you so much for coming in and sharing with us. What's the best way for people to reach out to you? Well,
there's all the typical ways, but the best way, and to get to get the kind of service and the personalized service and the involved service is to pick up the phone.
Okay.
I don't hesitate to talk to anyone who has a question and help them out. And I'm going to be able to give the most meaningful information if we have a dialogue.
Yeah.
But again, if we're talking specific contact information, my firm, the main number they can call is 213-418-9444. Contact me by email, and that is rhuddock@huddockemploymentlaw.com.
And we'll put all the links below, so just to make life easy for everyone.
But so email, but a call is always best.
Yeah, I agree. You know, people lose that personal touch just attached to the cell phones all the time and texting, but very rarely will you receive a call these days. So I like that. Let's go.
Well, in areas complex as this is, to make it really any kind of meaningful, depending upon the complexity of the question, you have to have a dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to share with us. We look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thank you for having me again.